I appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk to you guys, but I kind of got baptism by fire in the state of Washington. I was hired in as state veterinarian. It started on November the 3rd. And Washington's kind of my second state. I went to vet school in Pullman, Washington, which is down here in the southeast corner of the state. And because I was a New Mexico person, I couldn't go home every long weekend and such, so I'd hook on rides to the West Coast with my friends that were over from the Seattle area and various other parts of the state. So in 4 years of being in Pullman, I saw pretty much every corner of the state of Washington. I really liked it. It's a great place. But a couple of things about it. Everybody's pretty familiar with Seattle and the Puget Sound area. Our offices are down here at the bottom of the sound where these two freeways intersect right here. We have the Cascade Range, which separates the western Washington from the typically more agricultural eastern Washington areas. We have a lot of cattle industry in the mountains across northern and northeastern Washington. We have a very fertile farming valley down here where the Yakima and Columbia rivers come together. A real diverse state with a lot of agriculture, not so much a huge commercial poultry industry, although we do have some. But the best thing about this map to me is this is a map of our incidence of highly pathogenic avian influenza when I started to work in Washington. And it didn't last very long. We got a report on December 1st of 2014 that there was two confirmed positive flocks with highly pathogenic H5N2 virus in the Fraser Valley area of British Columbia. I'll step back right quick to orient you. Right up here, you notice this dip in the highway, and that little dot right there is Abbotsford, British Columbia. And that keep that dip in the highway in your minds because it shows up on some of these other maps. So here's our highway dip right here. Here's Abbotsford. And they had two flocks. These are the infected zones that were established around those flocks, and then the surveillance zones outside of them. And as you well notice, they stop abruptly at the Washington border. In the course of the next 3 weeks, they found a total of 12 positive flocks, backyard and commercial, along this area. Our avian specialist, Dr. Lynden describes this area as an incredibly dense poultry population. You can basically stand in the middle of the valley and see birds from one end to the other. And so it wasn't real surprising that there was the spread that they noticed and experienced there. So we kind of assumed that our problem would be in northern Whatcom County. And again, that area of infection's about right up here. And we just, because this is the way everybody's been taught AI is going to behave, we figured it would trickle into the state somehow from British Columbia, and we'd end up with it in Whatcom County. And we were discussing with USDA establishing what we were going to call a high-risk surveillance zone in that county so we'd catch it early. And right about the same time that we did that, or were planning that, we got a report, and again, this is our dip in the highway right here. Abbotsford's right about here. We got a report from a falconer who had a premise just a half mile from the Canadian border that he had some sick falcons. They had become ill after consuming wild duck meat and had shown neurological signs for a fairly short period, and 2 of them had died. Those were submitted, and we found them to be positive for H5N8. H5N2's up here. What's going on? So that was really our first surprise. Our movement into Washington from British Columbia really didn't happen the way it was supposed to. And as it turned out, the H5N8 virus is the Eurasian H5N8 strain. It's genetically identical. That's the virus that came over the flyway system from Europe and Asia. And the H5N2 is from genetic reassortment, where they've traded The H5N8 traded some genetic material with some of the existing low-path avian influenza strains in Canada and the Northwest, and spawned this high-path H5N2. And just about coincidental with our discovery of the falconers problem was a die-off of ducks reported in Weiser Lake. And I'll go to a little bit bigger map. Weiser Lake is right here, and our falconers place is right there. So what we ended up doing is, at least on paper, creating an expansion of the Canadian surveillance zones down into the state of Washington, 10 kilometers, and then we drew a 10-kilometer circle around Weiser Lake because they found the pintail duck with H5N2, and now we thought we really would have this well surrounded and well monitored. Only a couple of problems with that. We have one poor field veterinarian that lives in Lynden, which is about right here at that intersection, and to her credit, she ended up sampling birds from over 110 premises in that area basically by herself over the course of about 3 months. And but we didn't have the boots on the ground to do a bunch of active surveillance. The other problem I had with that is the experiences in Canada and our experiences with the falconer were that these viruses were killing birds very rapidly. And I didn't feel from the get-go that we'd get very far down the road testing a bunch of live, healthy birds. Avian influenza, these high-pass strains that we've been dealing with appear to have an incubation period of about 4 to 5 days. Clinical symptoms for 0 to 2 days, much closer to 0 in most of the cases. So these birds incubated quickly, died fast. They weren't around long enough to spread it much, and the only way you're going to find the virus in a healthy-looking bird is if you happen to hit that window of about 2 days where they're shedding the virus but not yet symptomatic or dead. And so we did assure USDA that we would surveil heavily in this area. And we held a town hall meeting up in Lynden. Was, I think, reasonably well attended. We had about 50 of the locals up there that were interested enough to come out. We had a lot of informational materials. One of the interesting things we did was put a couple of footbaths outside the door, and we purposely only used one entry into the hall. And it was kind of interesting to see how many people used the footbath or even asked what it was there for. And unfortunately, it was not a large majority of people that stepped into the footbaths and cleaned their boots. On the way in, more of them did it on the way out after our talks. But we're all geared up to be sampling up here in northern Whatcom County. And we get a report of a die-off of turkeys and chickens in Benton City, Washington. Benton City's down in that area where the Yakima and Columbia rivers come together. And this gentleman had lost a good number, all of his turkeys. I think he had about a dozen turkeys. And a good number of chickens and one goose. As this has played out in Washington, all the bad stuff happened near important landmarks of time. This one being New Year's Eve. We had people out sampling birds on New Year's Eve, and they were confirmed H5 positive on New Year's Day. And in this case, there's at the confluence of those rivers, there's wildlife parks, waterfowl areas, sanctuaries, and they're just a few miles from this farm. So, and he had flying species of ducks that would leave, commingle with the wild ducks, come back and bring some of the wild ducks with them, and they'd fly in and waddle around on his acre of property, and so there was obvious commingling of birds there. And that was our first domestically held domestic poultry flock, and we depopulated that flock on the 5th of January. But there was one other additional problem. We had, our rules in Washington don't allow us to create a zone, a quarantine zone. We can quarantine an individual premise for the presence of or suspicion of disease, but we can't just throw a blanket over an area. So we had to write emergency rules, and part of the emergency rulemaking process was creating maps. Well, USDA wants you to draw circles, and here's our infected circle, and then this would be our surveillance circle, but it becomes very challenging to know, well, where exactly, Fred Smith's place over here somewhere off this road, but is he in that circle? Is he out of that circle? So what we then had to do is our mapping people had to find geopolitical landmarks that they could draw the outer limits of that surveillance zone. And unfortunately, this is an example of where we didn't quite come up to USDA standards. USDA wants you to have movement restrictions in place in 12 hours after diagnosis of a positive flock. Well, it took us over 3 days just to get this map drawn. Literally, it was just a cumbersome process. We hadn't done it before. We didn't exercise map drawing as part of our avian influenza plan, and so this became kind of problematic for us. But we did get the map generated, and you'll notice we got a couple of circles on there because it seems that when the birds first started dying on our index premise down here in Benton City, the friend of his that had about 150 ducks on that premises, they figured they were being poisoned, so he wanted to take his ducks away from the risk of being poisoned, and he moved them up to his premises here and took the disease with him. So we lost 2 flocks down there, and hence the shape of our area, and these were depopulated just a day apart, this one on January the 6th. We cleaned and disinfected this property. It was an acre, and we did a good enough job that our field veterinarians that participated said that we probably raised their property value significantly. They did a heck of a job. But this property up here is a 5-acre place. It's got a lot of stuff on it, hundreds of plastic 5-gallon buckets. It's got trailers. It's got trash, pallets, you name it, and it had a whole bunch of birds, about 400 or 500 birds. And nobody really knew how to clean and disinfect that place. And at one point they got an estimate for a commercial operator to come in and clean and disinfect, and the estimate was for about $400,000. Hence the decision to let it lay fallow for a period of time rather than going through cleaning and disinfection. So where this farm was cleaned and disinfected, and could theoretically at this point have repopulated with birds, this fellow's in the midst of a flock plan that's going to have him sit fallow for 180 days, or at least 120 days, depending on what he finally decides to do. So that was when the USDA first really kind of stepped in and helped us out, and they sent the surveillance teams to Benton County or Benton Franklin counties. And just as a note, and I think I have a slide coming up on it, but in the infected zone, the effort is made to go door to door, knock on each premises. Do you have poultry? Can we sample them? And if the answer is no, we don't have poultry, or yes, we do, but you cannot sample them, then they're given informational handouts and thanked and go to the next place. When USDA took on most of that, if not all of that role. And the good news is the buy-in in Benton County and all of our quarantined areas was very high. We had very few people that said, no, you cannot sample my birds. So our next surprise, everybody that we had available, everybody we had available was down here in Benton County, and we got a report of a single dead goose in Port Angeles, Washington. Port Angeles is in Clallam County. This is a very incredibly scenic area up on the northern end of the Olympic Peninsula. It's a vacationer's paradise. It's an incredible place. And there's some backyard poultry in here, and this lady had 120 birds, mixed flock, turkeys, ducks, chickens, and lost 1 goose. And we've got all of our people here 250 miles away as the duck flies, and we almost dismissed that. We almost said, well, we just don't have anybody to go sample that goose. I talked to Dr. Badco, and we decided, well, let's give her a FedEx label, and she can double bag the bird and ship it to our avian health lab in Puyallup, Washington, which is down around here, and we'll at least get a sample that way. And so we did that, and the bird was positive for H5N2. And interestingly, even by the time all that was confirmed, she'd only lost 1 more goose and 1 chicken. The message in that episode was you can't count on HPAI to behave like HPAI in every case, because sometimes it doesn't kill the birds like it's supposed to. Didn't follow the book. That flock was also depopulated, and Lynn, I think that was the weekend of the playoff game, the Seahawks game. So we had staff up here that was dispatched to Port Angeles right in the middle of the Seahawks' big playoff game that they came back in the last 30 seconds and won. I told you things happened at bad times. So this was our zone there. We were helped out by the ocean, so we only had to find geopolitical boundaries for about 2/3 of our circle. Then our next episode, and fortunately for us, these were spaced out far enough that our people could just keep going from one to the other. They didn't ever really hit two different places at the same time, thankfully. So we got a report from a Gamebird farmer in Okanogan County. This is a tremendous county, a mountainous country, cattle country, another scenic area of the state. Fellow raised pheasants, quail, chucker, partridge, and had a lot of ducks. And he was already on our radar because he had low path come in here, and the thinking was that because he piped in river water from the river that ran right by his property, that he was probably bringing in the virus with him in the river water, untreated, raw river water, and he'd run it into his pens for his ducks and create ponds, big puddles really. He'd create some ponds so his dabbling ducks could dabble, and so we knew he had risk. And so we weren't too surprised when he called up and said, we've got a problem here. He lost 40 pheasant and about a dozen turkeys in about a week's time. And birds tested and positive H5N2. And right about the same time we're mobilizing a team there, just up the road we get a call from Oroville that the lady has a mixed flock, mainly exhibition birds, 4-H birds, that kind of thing. Death loss. Lost about half a flock or more in just a few days. And so we have two places now in Okanogan County. And this was, if I recall, Lynn, wasn't this Super Bowl weekend? This was Super Bowl weekend, but the good news is we couldn't mobilize a depop team until the Monday after Super Bowl. Now, the depop team did go up there severely depressed because the Seahawks lost in the Super Bowl, as some of you may know. So both of these were depopulated. And this flock premises was cleaned and disinfected. This one just went through disinfection last week. And you can see from the time of depop, we let the owner clean this, and then the USDA and Washington State Department of Ag sent a team up to finish up with the cleaning and do the disinfection with Virkon. We had one little issue that might come up, and that is the issue of indemnity. USDA has indemnity funds, Washington does not, but USDA pays for live birds that are euthanized in the course of a depopulation. Well, this fellow tried to claim he had birds that he had an invoice for, but had never received. And so there was a little distrust created. He claimed he had about 4,000 to 5,000 birds to euthanize, when in fact I think they did about 2,500. And that disparity was a shipment of 1,500 ducks that he had been invoiced for but never got. And so those are our cases to date. This is our quarantine around the riverside, the Gamebird farm in Okanogan County. And I bring this one up to, this is another hole that some folks might step in if they have an outbreak. And that is, our mappers came up with this nice map, and it was real hard here because this is a fairly rural area. There's not a lot of roads and so forth, but we had this all mapped out and published, and I got a phone call that blistered my ear from the Colville tribal authorities, because right down here, this is where about where our 10-kilometer surveillance zone would have cut. And if you read right down below there, Colville Confederated Tribes, our mapping people were using ArcGIS mapping program, did not have the layer that showed tribal lands. It was an innocent mistake on our part. And I backpedaled very rapidly, apologized tremendously, tried to point out that it was an innocent mistake. Long story short, our ADD, John Huntley, had to step in and kind of calm things down. He said, you know, Doc, just step aside. This is a federal issue. They were literally threatening us with political and legal fallout from this and so forth. It was a very innocent mistake. The other problem we had is there's a lot of tribal held lands all up and down this river valley that don't show up on any map on anywhere else except the county records. And if you didn't know about them, you'd walk onto tribal sovereign land and knock on a door, and that gets you in hot water. So this was problematic for us. It worked out because the Colville folks, once they kind of calmed down, agreed that in all of the tribal lands they would take the same approach. So they placed their tribal lands under quarantine. They did surveillance. Our folks showed them how to sample birds and so forth. So it was covered, but it was a little awkward getting there. And then this was our other quarantine in Okanogan County, and you'll notice it has a flat top. We paid Canada back for the Fraser Valley. Our surveillance zone stopped at the Canadian border, and I hope that they did a little surveillance north of there, although in truth, I don't know how important surveillance is around these. We had no spread from any of these flocks. The first flock that was infected in Benton County had a neighboring flock of about 16 chickens, separated by wire fencing, never sick, tested negative, they were fine. Literally, you could see the two sets of birds, standing in one point, and that flock's unaffected. So there's a lot of inconsistencies in the way this spread. And again, door-to-door canvassing in the infected zone. In these outer areas in the surveillance zone, we rely much more on what I'd call passive surveillance, responding to dead bird calls, following up if there's a high-risk flock where you knew some birds were moved out of here, you go test that flock for sure. But we didn't do door-to-door out in these areas like this. To release those quarantines, surveillance has to be deemed adequate by USDA, and that really translates into deemed adequate by our international trading partners. We've done enough surveillance in the infected zone and the surveillance zone to show that there's no more disease present in those circles, in those areas. And then, if the surveillance and results are adequate, 21 days after the flock is depopulated, if there's been no additional positives, you can release your quarantine zone. So, in our case, all three of our quarantine zones have been lifted in that 21-day window. We did not find any spread laterally from farm to farm. We did not find any more than the single infected flocks, except in Benton County, where we knew how it was transferred. And so we've been fortunate. Yes, sir.
Did you do any second testing?
No, and we weren't asked to, because these were all backyard flocks. None of these were commercial operators, and we were only.
Right now in Missouri, we just had a couple. They insist that every backyard flock within that 10 kilometers be tested 2 times before it can move.
Yep. And there's been a lot of buzz about USDA wanting to be more careful now. And I think that part of that is because we've had commercial flocks affected in the Mississippi Flyway now. And the other reason is because, well, it's a bigger deal now. It's getting into some of our bigger poultry growing areas. And so that's a good point. We had some additional surveillance efforts that we did to help with the convincing of trading partners that we didn't have a disease issue in the state. When this first hit, we asked all of our commercial operators to sample all of their mortalities on a daily basis, which was kind of a no-brainer, and they all did it willingly and voluntarily. We also had a program where our field veterinarians would try to get by the markets in our state that sell poultry. These are not live bird markets in that context. They're more livestock markets that have poultry sales. Usually once a week. We were hitting them about once a month if the vets could fit it in, but we went to testing them on every sale day. And that was a good way to sample because you got an accumulation of birds from multiple premises, and we'd get all the information where the birds were being consigned from and so forth. We also have a program in Washington that dates back to when Canada had HPAI 10 years ago, and it's a testing of what were determined to be high-risk flocks, mainly by location, size of flock, management, and so forth. And that was an ongoing thing. They're typically tested once or twice a year, and we stepped that up, particularly in Whatcom County, tried to sample frequently. And then we tried our best to respond to sick and dead bird calls, because I felt strongly that that's where we were going to find the disease. Every one of our flocks popped up with a dead bird as a signalment, or dead birds. This was, yeah.
On your sampling, so our current, from the lab side, our current protocols say for wild birds we can't pool, but you were dealing with backyard flocks. Did y'all pool?
We pooled in poultry, not waterfowl. So if they were ducks, they were individually sampled, geese individually sampled, but if they were chickens, they could be pooled. Okay. Yeah. So we really, the main thing to understand in this slide is if you have high path hitcher state, you're going to employ a lot of people's effort in trying to respond to it. Our laboratory system, both the Washington Animal Diagnostic Disease Lab in Pullman and the Animal Health and Food Safety Lab in Puyallup, had their folks working overtime. They did a tremendous job responding to the surge of samples that was generated by all of this surveillance sampling being done. And we employed Fish and Wildlife. They were doing sampling of dead waterfowl, but they also helped us in some cases transport dead birds to the lab. They were extremely helpful. And of course, USDA, both the lab in Ames and veterinary services bringing in incident management teams were really critical to us being able to manage the response and keep on top of everything. And I think the one lesson we really learned is it's fortunate that USDA can step in and play that role, because the state people start wearing out. USDA rotates in incident management teams that have a specified time, a period they can stay, and they're gone, and a new team comes in. Well, I was looking at all of our field veterinarians dragging around, and they didn't have anybody to replace them. And we had to keep telling Thomas Gilliam to go to the next place, Thomas. You'll get next week off. And then, next week there'd be another flock, and Thomas is going on that response. The state people start wearing out pretty quick in this. We have this problem, and this is the summering grounds where the commingling of the migratory species are. This is basically the map that the gospel started to be preached to me when I first got into regulatory medicine in New Mexico and was working in meat inspection, and this is how it was going to happen. And every year after 2006 that it didn't happen, I started getting a little more skeptical. Why, this is a bunch of, this is typical government overreaction. This is never going to happen. Well, it did. It could have happened either before I got up to Washington or something, but this is how it happened, and this is the common grounds. And if you really look at the flyway systems, I mean, here's all of our states out west that have had either positive domestic fowl or wild waterfowl or both, and here's the Midwestern ones, and I mean they're just tracking with the flyway systems. It's there. And my guess is, I heard some reports from down in my old stomping grounds in New Mexico that Game and Fish was going to be sampling down there, and I wouldn't be surprised if they picked up a few positive birds down there. But this is a flyway issue, and we really feel like it's going to stay around, and we're going to have these isolated flocks. I talked about the reassortment. I don't need to pound on this one very much. The H5N8 is the Asian strain, H5N2, and we did have a pintail duck that turned up H5N1, and that really lit up the board because that was going to be the pandemic. H5N1 is the one that was killing people in Asia several years ago, and we had already had to kind of rein in our Department of Health because they wanted to run in on all these infected flock owners and get them on Tamiflu and feed them all sorts of this information on how at risk they are on the heels of us telling them there was little or no zoonotic potential in these viruses. So we really had an issue, and we were just kind of getting that all salted out when H5N1 was reported, and then that kind of ramped things up again as far as the fear factor goes. CDC and the health department does have a valid worry, and that is if some of these avian strains get into people that are also sick with seasonal flu, and some of this reassortment goes on, we could create a strain that would become highly infectious for people and create a huge problem. I mean, the reality is the state of Washington's had over 120 people die of influenza A this flu season. And you don't hear anything about that, but you've got this fear factor about what could happen with the combination, and it is a real concern. It may not be highly likely, but it is a real concern. Effect on the commercial poultry industry. This is where I feel like an idiot up here talking to people in the poultry industry. But it hits your bottom line. This needs to actually be updated. I think they may have pulled an old one. There's 45 countries now that have placed some sort of restriction on U.S. poultry shipments. Some of the Asian countries not only have banned shipment of poultry and poultry products from states with high path, but even if the shipments go through, they're banning it. Well, you take what was going on there and you combine it with the port slowdown that was going on all the western ports because of union squabbles, and we couldn't ship a lot of things off the ports, and it just, that double whammy for the poultry industry was killing any commercial operators that wanted to ship overseas. We had one episode that we fought with. We have right close to that Fraser Valley area, not far from where the falconer was, we have an operator who raises day-old chicks, sends them into BC to a parent company to raise, gets his eggs in from Arkansas, hatches them, ships day-olds across the border. As soon as we had positive flocks, Canada bars shipment, has no market for his day-old chicks, and on a couple, 3 days where we had these positive flocks and Canada imposed those restrictions, he had to euthanize chicks, and he actually ended up euthanizing over 35,000 chicks. Backyard flocks is all we had in Washington. You know, what's the deal with commercial? Well, my message to all the poultry owners in Washington is you're all part of the industry. I don't care if you have 2 egg layers in a little coop in your backyard or whether you got 5 barns with 100,000 broilers in them. You're part of an industry, and the risk is really to the entire industry, no matter where the infection gets spread. We know we have commercial flocks in California, Minnesota, Missouri. They're positive. Trade restrictions are increasing, and the question I put at the bottom is, I'm interested to see over a little more time if the attitude's going to change, because we got these bad bugs on both sides of the Pacific now. I mean, it's kind of like, your mama's ugly. Well, yours is ugly too. Well, you got it. Well, you got it. Well, I know you are, but what am I? I mean, how long can this fight go across the Pacific when we both have these viruses circulating around? I couldn't figure out why Canada, their response when we asked them, why did you embargo? I'll go back to I won't. Up here in Whatcom County and the Fraser Valley and down here in Benton, they embargo everything from Washington when Benton County hit. I said, what's the wisdom of that? Well, we want to make sure that those birds that are entering Canada through the port at Sumas, which is in Whatcom County, are not coming from an infected area or an area of surveillance. I felt like screaming at them, look at the map. They're not. Here's the guy with the day-old chicks. He's 3 miles from your border. Here's the circle where the infected backyard flock is. It's 250 miles away. The wisdom to me would have either been to immediately recognize our surveillance and infected zones and our quarantines, or just bar the whole state and not change whether it was cleaned up or quarantined or not. Just say the risk is everywhere, because the waterfowl are everywhere. Last couple of comments. We spent a bunch of money. We use a time tracking program in our computers to track all of our employees' time. So we put a category in for the high path response, and we've spent. I'd say this keeps going up because we just had another task force that went out and decontaminated or disinfected that Gamebird farm. So this is probably up over 150,000 or more now. And this doesn't even count all the lab testing that USDA has paid for, which has been tremendous. You can see the number of samples that have been run in our lab system alone, and it just, this just adds up. Luckily, we were allowed to spend cooperative agreement funds. The good news is we had some left to spend. The bad news is they're gone now, and we're not out of March yet, and the new cycle doesn't start until April 1st. Some of the problems, again, I mentioned they want movement controls in 12 hours. Sometimes states just can't do that. We got to where I think our last quarantine or two, we were on it. We had those rules written up, and we had the maps drawn really efficiently, but the first one was pretty awkward. Tribal land era is an innocent one, and really you got to be sure if you have tribal lands in your state that you work with tribal officials from the get-go. Additional issues we faced are depopulation. We ended up using CO2 gas. We have a KIFCO foamer, but the KIFCO really needs kind of an enclosed area where you can build that foam up and corral it and let it layer deep enough to euthanize the birds. And these were all backyard flocks and outdoor pens, and we would have had to create walls with plastic sheeting and what we ended up doing was just getting a lot of large 50-gallon trash cans, double bag them, put the birds in them, run a pipe in with CO2, and so the birds are double bagged, they're dead, and you just close the bags up, disinfect the outside, and you're done with that one. We have the indemnity process is a problem because it did take a little time, and these birds are dying fast, and they only pay for the live ones. So it doesn't take long for the producer to realize the longer everybody drags their feet on getting these birds killed, the more money I'm losing. And we had a couple of discussions over that with some of these producers. This is kind of, I guess, the euthanasia epidemiological triangle. We have to be able to destroy these animals to control spread of disease. We have to be concerned about the animal welfare issues and use approved methods. And we have to do it in a manner that doesn't jeopardize the health of the operators or the producers and so forth. But we also have another little outpouching of this, and that is the public perception of how we're doing this. And that's always kind of a fine line to walk. Disposal, we had these all considered. We ended up incinerating birds from Benton County and from Clallam County, and we ended up using a renderer to take the birds from Okanogan County. And in all cases, it worked out quite well for us. We were able to transport birds when we needed to without contaminating the environment. The rendering truck works well because those have to be sealed. They can't leak as they trundle down the road. And so, again, with your carcass disposal, you've got to fulfill all sorts of regulatory requirements. Your environmental folks, the landfill operators may or may not take them. You have to really be doing it in a way that is economically feasible for you and practical. One thing we noticed is on composting on site, which I'm sold on as a great method to destroy dead poultry, but these owners didn't want these birds on their place. You have to realize up in Port Angeles, in Clallam County, the lady kissed every goose goodbye before it was euthanized. You don't want those geese in a pile under a bunch of wood chips composting in your backyard. Not when you relate to them like that. So this isn't your commercial poultry industry. This is your pets. And so composting didn't sell to our backyard flock owners that were affected by this disease. It might have been a great way to do it, but it wasn't going to go because of that issue. One of the things we did from the get-go that was tremendous is use a public information officer. If you don't have somebody that's in that capacity, you probably ought to get somebody. We tried to message, we had calls with USDA, and we had them daily there for a while in the midst of things, and we had a DOH rep, and this is kind of one of the holes we stepped in. Just because you're having informational calls doesn't mean your information's getting spread around. This is the same thing as just because you put information on a Facebook page doesn't mean the horse is reading it when you lead them to water. You've got to realize that the communication is where that's the biggest hole that you're going to step in, and that's the one we stepped in. It's the one I stepped in personally. But we had a DOH rep on the calls, and then we got information that the DOH influenza specialist was getting none of our information and was upset because she was left out of the picture. Well, dang, what can we do? We're assuming that the DOH rep on the call would spread our wealth of knowledge through his agency, and it just stopped with him. So again, don't assume that just because your message is going out there that everybody's radio's on. Inconsistencies in messaging between agencies, the thing about the zoonotic risk and Tamiflu. We're telling them you're not at risk, and the state health people are wanting them on Tamiflu. And everybody knows about Tamiflu because we talked about it in the news incessantly when H5N1 was going to come kill us all. So people hear Tamiflu and they think, oh, this has got to be serious. They want to put me on Tamiflu. The impact of reporting that, the H5N1 in the wild waterfowl, even though H5N1 didn't get any of our domestic flocks, just knowing it was out there in the pool kind of worried everybody. The PIOs, excellent. And one of the biggest things is you got to be aware of those mixed messages because you may not catch them, the other agency may not catch them, but the public will catch every gaffe, every mistake you make, every misspeak you create. And it's like the sign down here in the bottom. And sometimes you just, even though the best way to do it is just say, oops, I made a mistake. Sometimes that doesn't sell very well, even like the Okanogan tribe issues. And so we had other issues up there, and I'm going to throw myself under the bus. They had a new state veterinarian in Washington who didn't know even the people in his own agency. At one point, my boss, who's sitting here in the front row, Lynn Briscoe, had to call me aside and say, Doc, you don't need to do all this yourself. She said, we got people here that can help you do things. Just talk to them, delegate. And I looked at her and I said, I don't know the people. I've only been here 3.5 weeks. That was a problem for us, and so and we kind of had to get with the program over that. The time demands will sink you. I got more emails. It took me half a day just to get through all the email traffic and answer the important ones and so forth. Everybody wants to interview you. There's conference calls. They had calls to plan calls, meetings to plan calls to plan meetings. The stress on everybody. The flock owners were stressed out. Certainly our commercial producers, even though we had no affected flocks in our commercial sector, they were on pins and needles over this. And it was costing them every day. The regulatory officials were stressed. The lab personnel were stressed. And we all kind of felt like, here's our to-do list for the day. Get everything done. And you really do get kind of wrapped up in all this. And the funniest part was when we finally kind of hit this hiatus and we didn't have any more active cases, I was thinking one night, sitting in my apartment, we'd only had 5 positive flocks, and they were all relatively small backyard flocks except for the Gamebird producer. And we'd gone through all of this stress and all of this upheaval and all of these meetings and phone calls and arguments and deployments and depopulations, and it was a huge deal. 5 flocks. 5 small flocks. And I thought to myself, where would we be? 2 thoughts. Where would we be if that had been in 2 or 3 large commercial poultry operators? And where would it be if we were fighting a disease in the cattle industry with the same kind of, we got to come in and kill all your cattle here? Holy cow, that would have been in the news. And there were a lot of people that didn't even know we had bird flu in the state of Washington. We were on Facebook. We had a web page. We were in the newspaper. And I talked to a couple of friends of mine, and they go, oh, are you dealing with avian influenza? Oh. So you can't assume that your message is out there as far as you do. And this is my slide that kind of sums up the experience of how things went in Washington for a period from December 1st until about the first week or so in March. And they're all kind of relevant. And my favorite is the chickens watching the horror movie of the duck swimming in the pond. But really, I mean, you feel this way. It's just you get into kind of a vortex of activity, and you almost have to just kind of stop. It's like riding a merry-go-round. Stop and get your bearings, and then jump back on and ride it again. But unfortunately, sometimes you don't have a lot of time to jump off. It just keeps coming and keeps coming and keeps coming. So.